The snow no longer felt cold. Alara Windholt knew, somewhere in the healer's part of her mind that still worked, that this was the surest sign something was terribly wrong with her body. Her wrists were wrapped in iron chains, bolted to a post at the edge of the Thornwake border, the line no wolf from the Veyrath pack was allowed to cross without the Alpha's word. She was not crossing it. She was being left at it, like a parcel nobody wanted delivered. 3 moons ago, Alara had been the happiest Omega in the whole pack, because the Alpha, Cashin Veyrath, loved her in secret, and she loved him back with everything an orphan girl had to give, which was to say all of it, because she had never learned how to love anything halfway. Tonight, she was chained to a post while her mate slept in his warm bed, and his beta, Bram Castle, walked away from her without once turning back. "Bram," she called out, her voice cracking like the ice under her knees. "Bram, please tell Cashin, tell him where I am. He would never." "He already knows enough," Bram said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. A kind voice delivering a cruel sentence was a sound she knew she would carry forever if she lived long enough to carry anything at all. "Rest now, Alara. The cold will make it quick." Then he was gone, and she was alone with the wind and the 2 heartbeats inside her that were not her own. She pressed her bound hands to her belly as best the chains allowed. "SHH," she whispered, though neither of her pups had ever needed quieting. They had been calm since the day the healer told her there were 2 of them, a boy and a girl, tangled together as though they had promised each other before they were even born that they would face the world side by side. "SHH, little ones. Mama's here." She had not always known it would end this way. Nobody ever does. If someone had told her, 3 moons ago, that loving an Alpha would end with her freezing at the edge of his territory while carrying his children, she would have laughed and said that only happens in the stories the old wolves tell pups to frighten them into obedience. But the story does not begin at the border. It begins 6 years earlier, with a boy who found a starving Omega girl half dead in a hunting trap, and did not walk away. Alara was 16 when Cashin Veyrath cut the iron trap from her leg with his bare claws, his hands shaking with a fury she did not understand yet, because she did not yet know that Alphas could feel rage on behalf of someone who was nothing to them. "Who did this to you?" he had asked, and she remembered thinking his eyes were the exact color of the sky right before a storm breaks, silver gray and restless. "Poachers," she told him, "from outside the pack lands. I was gathering herbs." He carried her the whole way back to the healer's den himself, refusing to let anyone else touch her, and something about the way he held her, careful, as though she were made of something precious rather than something broken, planted a seed in her that took years to bloom into what she could only call love, though back then she called it gratitude, because gratitude was a safer word for an Omega orphan to use about her Alpha. She grew up in the healer's den after that. Old Ren, the pack's healer, took her in as an apprentice, and Alara learned the names of every root and flower that could mend a wolf's body. She was good at it, better than good. By the time she was 20, packs from 3 territories over were sending riders to beg for her remedies. Cashin visited often. At first he said it was to check on his healer's progress. Then he stopped pretending that was the reason. "You don't have to make an excuse every time you come here," she told him once, laughing. As he stood in the doorway holding a bouquet of frostbloom he clearly did not know how to give a person. "I'm the Alpha," he said, mock offended. "I don't need an excuse to visit my own pack lands." "You need an excuse to visit me, though," she said, "which is different." He had gone quiet then, and something shifted in his face, the way weather shifts before a wolf can smell the rain coming. "Alara," he said, "I think I have been finding excuses to see you since I was 17 years old and did not have the courage to call it what it was." That was the first time he told her he loved her. She did not believe him at first, not fully, because Omegas like her were not supposed to end up loved by Alphas like him. They were supposed to end up useful, grateful, quiet in the corner of someone else's story. But Cashin kept coming back, kept saying it in 100 different ways until she finally let herself believe it. And when he marked her as his mate under the old oak behind the healer's den, with no one watching but the stars, she thought she had won something no orphan girl was ever supposed to win. She did not know, then, that his family had promised him to someone else since before either of them were born. Her name was Seraphine Drogmore, daughter of the neighboring Drogmore pack, and the betrothal between her family and Cassion's had been signed in blood ink 2 generations back, sealing an alliance neither pack could afford to break. Cassion had never told Elara. She found out the way most Omegas find out things they were never meant to know, by accident, from the mouth of someone who wanted her to suffer from the knowing. "You didn't know," Bram had said to her the day Seraphine's caravan arrived at the border, his voice carrying that same gentle cruelty she would hear again the night she was chained to this post. "Cassion never told you. Elara, the alliance has been promised since we were pups. Seraphine is meant to be Luna. You were always going to be something else." She remembered how the word else had landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she would still be feeling months later, with her wrists bound in iron. But there was more to tell before the ending. Elara owed it to her pups, kicking gently against her bound hands, to have the story told properly. They deserved to know their mother's story did not begin in chains. It began in love, real love, the kind that made a broken orphan girl believe, for a little while, that she was worth choosing. She just did not yet understand how much a pack's fear of losing power could poison even the truest kind of love. Elara confronted Cassion the same night she learned about Seraphine, standing in the war room of Vayreth Hall with her arms crossed, and her heart doing something complicated between breaking and hopping. "Is it true," she asked him, "the betrothal?" He did not lie to her, which she would give him even later, even chained at the border with frost creeping up her forearms. "It's true," he said. "But Elara, it means nothing. It's an old arrangement my father made before I was even born. I never agreed to love her. I only agreed the packs would stand together if the North ever pushed south again." "And what happens when she arrives expecting to be your Luna?" "She won't be," he said, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "You are my Luna, Elara. In my heart you were my Luna the day I marked you under the oak tree. The betrothal is politics. What we have is real." She wanted so badly to believe that politics could simply be waved away by a man's private feelings. She would learn, in time, that packs do not run on private feelings. They run on treaties, and treaties do not care who loves whom. "Then tell the elders," she said. "Tell them you've already chosen your mate." Something crossed his face then, a flicker of hesitation so brief she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. "I will," he said, "when the time is right." The time, it turned out, was never right. There was always a reason to wait: the harvest festival, the border dispute with the Ashwood pack, his father's failing health, the need to keep the Drogmore alliance sweet just a little longer. Every excuse sounded reasonable on its own. Stacked together, over months, they built a wall between the truth and the pack that Elara did not see collapsing until it had already buried her. "Why do you let him wait?" Old Wren asked her one evening, as Elara ground bitterroot into paste for a wounded hunter. Wren had raised 3 pups of her own before losing her mate to a border skirmish decades ago, and she had a way of asking questions that cut straight to the marrow. "Because I love him," Elara said simply, "and because I believe him when he says it will be soon." Wren's silence told her more than words ever could have. She kept grinding her herbs, and after a long moment she said, quietly, "Belief is a fine thing, child, but a wolf cannot eat belief when winter comes." Elara did not understand what she meant then. She would understand it very well later, with the winter wind cutting through her chains. There was something else Elara did not know, back in those early days of love and waiting. Something Cassion himself did not fully know, though it would come to matter more than either of them could have guessed. The Vayreth name was not always simply the name of a border pack alpha. Long before Cassion's grandfather's grandfather ruled these lands, The Vayreth bloodline sat upon the high seat of all the northern packs. A crown of silver antlers passed from wolf to wolf for 100 generations, until a rebellion of jealous lords stripped the crown away and scattered the family into exile, erasing the title from every record they could burn. Only a few old wolves still remembered the truth, and fewer still spoke of it, because to speak of a lost crown is to invite the kind of attention that gets a family finished off entirely rather than merely humbled. Old Wren was one of the few who remembered. She told Alara the story late one night, half in secret, half like a confession she needed to unburden herself of before she died. The Vayreth line was never meant to end up guarding one border territory and bowing to the will of a council of elders, she said. They were meant to sit above every pack in the north. The bloodline carries a mark, passed only to true-born heirs of unbroken lineage, a ring of silver in the eye like a wolf staring into moonlight. Cashin doesn't have it. His father didn't either. The blood has been diluted for generations, watered down by marriages made for alliance instead of love. Then why does it matter now? Alara asked. Wren looked at her with an expression Alara could not read at the time, something between sorrow and hope. Because pure love produces pure blood, child. A bond formed the old way, the true way, not for politics, but because two hearts recognized each other. That is the only thing strong enough to wake a sleeping bloodline back up. Alara laughed it off then, the way one laughs off a bedtime story told by someone who loves you and wants to give your life more meaning than it has. She did not know, as she laughed, that she was already carrying the proof of Wren's words inside her, though she would not learn she was pregnant for another 2 moons. She did not know that somewhere in the pack, powerful wolves who feared exactly what Wren had described were already watching her far more closely than a simple healer's apprentice should ever be watched. There was a particular evening, before any of this began, that Alara would return to in her mind so many times over the years that it wore smooth like a river stone. Cashin had taken her to the northern ridge, where the whole of Vayreth territory spread out below them under a sky full of stars, and he had spread his cloak on the frozen ground so she would not have to sit directly on the cold earth, a small gesture of care that undid her more thoroughly than any grand declaration could have. "Do you ever wonder," she asked him that night, "what your father would think of you courting a healer's apprentice with no family name worth mentioning?" "My father spent his whole life worrying about names and alliances," Cashin said, pulling her against his side. "I have decided I would rather spend mine worrying about you." "That's a very romantic thing to say for an alpha who still hasn't told the council about us," she said, though she said it gently, teasing rather than accusing, because back then she still believed the telling was simply a matter of time rather than a wound that would fester the longer it went untended. "I will tell them," he said. "Alara, I promise you, the moment feels wrong tonight only because the Ashwood dispute has everyone on edge. Give me until spring." "You said that at midsummer," she reminded him, laughing despite herself. "I know," he admitted, laughing too, though something more serious moved behind his eyes. "I am not trying to hide you, Alara. I want you to understand that. I'm only trying to protect what we have from a council that has never once in my whole life let me keep something simply because I wanted it. I have watched them dismantle every soft thing my father ever loved in the name of the pack's greater good. I do not want to hand them the chance to dismantle you." She believed him completely that night under those stars, and it would be unfair to think too harshly of the boy he was then, because he had not been lying to her, not exactly. He genuinely believed that waiting was protection rather than avoidance, that careful timing was the same thing as courage. It would take losing everything for either of them to learn how wrong that belief truly was. "Marry me anyway," she said, only half joking, resting her head against his shoulder. "Quietly, under the oak tree, just the two of us and the moon as witness. Let the council find out afterward." He went very still beside her, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped, asked for more than a careful alpha's son could reasonably give. Then he turned, took her face gently in both hands, and kissed her with a tenderness that told her, before he ever said a single word, exactly what his answer would be. "Under the oak tree," he agreed softly. "Just the two of us and the moon." He kept that promise, at least. Whatever else came later, whatever fear eventually made him too slow and too careful when it mattered most, the boy on that ridge beneath those stars had loved her as honestly as any wolf has ever loved another. Alara would have to learn, slowly and painfully, that honest love and brave love are not always the same thing, and that a heart can be entirely true and still not be entirely enough, if it is never asked to risk anything to prove it. Seraphine Drogmore arrived at Vareth Hall on a grey morning in late autumn, and Alara understood immediately, standing at the edge of the crowd gathered to greet her, why the elders wanted this match. Seraphine moved like she had been raised knowing every eye in the room belonged to her. Her golden hair was braided with silver thread, and when she smiled at Cassian, it was the practiced smile of someone who had been taught since childhood that smiles were currency. "Alpha Cassian," she said, dipping into a graceful bow. "It has been too long." "Seraphine," he said, his voice carefully neutral, though Alara could see the discomfort behind his eyes. "Welcome to Vareth Hall." Alara watched from the shadows, her hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach, though she did not yet know what she was protecting. She told herself she had nothing to fear. Cassian loved her. He had said so 100 times, under the oak tree, in the healer's den, in the quiet hours before dawn when the whole pack was asleep, and it was just the two of them pretending, for a little while, that the world outside did not exist. She did not yet understand that pretending only works until someone forces you to open your eyes. Alara found out she was carrying pups on the same day. The Elders' Council summoned Cassian for a private meeting that lasted from sunrise until well past moonrise, and she would never be able to decide afterward whether the timing was cruel coincidence or the universe trying to warn her. Old Wren was the one who confirmed it. Her weathered hands pressed gently to Alara's stomach as she closed her eyes and listened the way only a true healer can listen, to the small, secret rhythms of a body that has quietly become a home for someone else. "Two," she said, and her eyes opened wide with something between shock and wonder. "Alara, there are 2 heartbeats in there, a boy and a girl." Alara laughed and cried at the same time, her hands shaking as she pressed them over Wren's. "Twins," she whispered. "Cassian's going to—" She stopped herself before she could finish the sentence, because for the first time since she had fallen in love with him, she felt a small, cold seed of doubt take root where certainty used to live. "Going to what child?" Wren asked gently. "Going to be happy," Alara said, though it came out sounding more like a question than a statement. She did not tell him right away. Some part of her, the part that had grown up in an orphan's den learning never to trust good news too quickly, wanted to wait until she understood what had happened in that long council meeting first. She did not have to wait long to find out, because Bram found her before Cassian did. "You should know something," Bram said, finding her alone in the herb garden behind the healer's den, his voice low and careful in the way it always was right before he delivered news meant to wound. "The council has set a date for Cassian's formal binding to Seraphine, 3 moons from now. The elders say the alliance can wait no longer, not with the Ashwood pack testing our northern border twice this season." The herb basket slipped from Alara's hands, scattering bitterroot and frostbloom across the frozen ground. "He told them no," she said, though it sounded weak even to her own ears. "He told me the arrangement meant nothing." Bram's expression softened into something that might have been pity had it not been laced with satisfaction. "Alara," he said, "Cassian is an alpha before he is anything else. You have always been someone he loves in the quiet hours. Seraphine is someone he will stand beside in the daylight in front of every pack in the north. That is simply how this world works." She wanted to scream at him that he was wrong, that Cassian had promised, that promises made under an oak tree meant more than treaties signed in blood ink by dead men decades ago. Instead, she stood very still in the ruined herb garden and felt the 2 small heartbeats inside her as if they had suddenly become the only steady thing left in a world that was tilting sideways. "Does he know?" she asked, About the binding date. Of course he knows, Bram said. He agreed to it this morning. Alara confronted Cashin that night, and she would remember every detail of that conversation the way one remembers the exact moment before an accident, when everything is still fine, and you do not yet know it is the last moment that will ever be fine again. "Tell me it isn't true," she said, standing in his private chambers, her arms wrapped around herself though the fire was warm. Cashin's face went pale. "Who told you?" "Does it matter who told me? Is it true?" He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Alara felt something inside her crack quietly, the way ice cracks under weight it was never built to hold. "Alara," he said finally, "the Ashwood Pack attacked 2 supply caravans on our northern border last week. If the Drogmore alliance breaks now, we lose 200 warriors we cannot afford to lose. I have to bind to Seraphine, publicly, politically. It changes nothing between us." "It changes everything between us," she said, her voice shaking. "You are going to stand in front of the whole pack and bind yourself to another woman, and you expect that to change nothing." "It's a political binding," he said, reaching for her hands. "Not a mate bond. You know the difference. You are still the only one I have ever truly marked, Alara. That bond cannot be undone by any ceremony the elders arrange." She wanted to tell him, right then, about the 2 heartbeats growing inside her. She opened her mouth to say it, and then she closed it again, because some instinct she did not fully understand yet, some old orphan's caution that had kept her alive through worse things than heartbreak, told her it was not safe to say it yet. Not until she understood how much danger those 2 small heartbeats might already be standing in. "I need time to think," she told him instead, and she left before he could see the tears she refused to let fall in front of him. Alara told him 3 days later in the end, because she could not bear to keep it from him any longer, and because some foolish, hopeful part of her believed that news of his children might change everything, might make him stand up to the elders and choose her in the daylight the way he had already chosen her in the dark. He held her for a long time after she told him, his hands trembling against her stomach the way they had trembled the day he cut her out of that poacher's trap 6 years earlier. "Twins," he whispered. "Alara, we're having twins." "You can't bind to Seraphine now," she said, not knowing this. "I know," he said, and for a moment hope bloomed so bright in Alara's chest that she nearly forgot to be afraid. "I'll speak to the council tomorrow. I'll tell them everything. Alara, this changes everything." She believed him. She truly believed him, standing in his arms that night with their children's heartbeats between them, because believing him was so much easier than the alternative, which was understanding that some men mean every word they say and still are not brave enough to act on it when the moment finally arrives. She did not know, as she fell asleep in his arms that night, that Bram had already been standing outside the door, listening. And she did not know that Bram had already decided, long before that night, that no child carrying Cashin Vareth's blood would ever be allowed to threaten the arrangement he had spent years quietly protecting on the elders' behalf. Bram Castle had never truly been Cashin's man alone, though Alara would not learn this until much later. For nearly 10 years, he had also served the Council of Elders, quietly, in ways that never showed on the surface, feeding them information, smoothing over problems before Cashin ever had to know they existed. Bram believed, with the kind of certainty that frightens in hindsight, that a strong pack needed a strong alpha, and a strong alpha could not afford distractions, mistakes, or inconvenient loves. In his mind, he was protecting Cashin from himself. He was also protecting something else, something far older and far more dangerous than a simple political alliance, though Alara would not understand that until it was almost too late. "You cannot let this continue," Elder Morden told Bram, in a conversation Bram would later recount to Alara himself, in the strange, quiet honesty that sometimes comes right before someone does something unforgivable, as though confessing the reasoning might excuse the act. "The healer's apprentice is carrying twins. Do you understand what that means, Bram? Do you understand the old prophecy about the Vareth bloodline?" "I've heard the old stories," Bram had said. "Superstition from before my grandmother's time." "Superstition," Mordine repeated. "That has kept this council in power for 4 generations, precisely because no true-born heir with the silver mark has been born since the exile. If Alara Windholt's children carry that mark, Bram, the entire structure of the Northern Pax changes. Every alliance we have built, every treaty, every careful balance of power gone, replaced by a bloodline claim no council could refuse without starting a war none of us would survive." "What are you asking me to do?" Bram had asked, though it seemed likely in his heart that he already knew the answer and was only asking to hear someone else say it first, so the responsibility would not sit on his shoulders alone. "I am asking you to remember your duty," Mordine said, "to the pack, not to one woman's happiness." Alara knew none of this yet. She only knew that Cassian had promised to speak to the council, and that 3 days passed with no word, and that on the 4th day he came to her with a face like a man walking to his own execution. "They won't hear it," he told her, sitting heavily on the edge of her bed in the healer's den, his head in his hands. "I told them everything, Alara. About you, about the twins, about wanting to name you Luna instead of Seraphine. They said the binding proceeds as planned, or the Drogmore alliance collapses entirely, and with it, our northern defense." "And what did you say?" she asked, though some part of her already knew from the way he could not meet her eyes. "I said I needed time," he said. "I haven't refused them, Alara. I just haven't agreed yet either." "That is the same thing as agreeing," she said quietly. "You know that, don't you? Every day you don't refuse them is a day closer to the binding happening anyway." He did not answer, and his silence told her everything his words had been too careful to say. "Cassian," she said, taking his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Do you love me, or do you love the idea of loving me while someone else runs your pack's future for you?" "That isn't fair," he said. "Isn't it?" she asked. "I am carrying your children, Cassian, and you cannot even give me a simple answer about whether I will be humiliated in front of the entire pack in 3 moons' time." He left without answering, and Alara sat alone in the healer's den for a long time afterward, her hands pressed to her belly, whispering apologies to 2 small heartbeats for a father who could not yet find the courage they deserved. Old Ren found her there an hour later, and she did not say anything at first, only sat beside Alara and held her hand the way she had held it the very first day Cassian carried her into the den, 6 years earlier. "You should leave," she said finally. Alara looked at her startled. "Leave, Ren, I have nowhere." "You have somewhere," she said. "You have skill in your hands that packs 3 territories over would pay a fortune to have close by. You do not need Cassian Vereth's name to survive, child. You only need it if you want to survive here in this pack under these elders. And I am beginning to fear that this pack is no longer a safe place for you or those pups." "He loves me," Alara said, though the words came out smaller than she meant them to. "I believe he does," Ren said gently. "I have watched that boy love you for 6 years, Alara, and I do not doubt the truth of his feeling for a moment. But love is not the same thing as courage, and I fear it will take more courage than Cassian Vereth currently possesses to stand against a council that has controlled this pack since before either of you were pups." Alara did not leave that night. She told herself she owed it to Cassian, to their children, to give him one more chance to find that courage before she gave up on him entirely. She would wonder many times afterward, chained at the border with frost climbing her skin, whether that choice to stay and hope was the bravest thing she ever did, or the most foolish. She never quite decided. The days that followed passed in a strange, tense quiet, the kind that settles over a den right before a storm breaks. Cassian visited often, always tender, always apologetic, always promising that he was working on a solution, that the council would come around, that she only needed to be patient a little while longer. Alara noticed, during those weeks, that Bram had begun watching her in a way she had not registered before, not the friendly, familiar attention of a beta who had known her for years, but something colder, more calculating, the way a hunter watches a trail before deciding whether the prey is worth the chase. "You've been quiet lately," she said to him once, when she found him lingering near the healer's den for the third time that week. "Have I?" he said, smiling in that gentle way of his that she had once mistaken for kindness. "I suppose I have a great deal on my mind. Being beta is a heavier burden than most wolves realize." "Is that all it is?" she asked. "What else would it be, Alara?" he said, and there was something in his eyes just for a moment that made the hair on the back of her neck rise, though she could not have named what frightened her about it if asked right then. She would understand it later, standing at the border with iron around her wrists. It was the look of a wolf who had already decided what he was going to do and was only waiting for the right moment to do it. Seraphine, for her part, watched the growing tension between Cassian and Alara with an expression Alara could never quite read, not triumph exactly, but something patient, calculating, the look of someone who understood that whatever love Cassian and Alara shared was a temporary obstacle rather than a permanent threat. "You should understand something, healer's apprentice," she told Alara once, cornering her in the great hall's corridor when no one else was near enough to overhear. "I did not choose this arrangement any more than you chose to fall in love with a man who cannot keep a promise, but I intend to see it through, because unlike you, I understand that some things matter more than a woman's private happiness." "And what things are those?" Alara asked, her hand instinctively moving to shield her belly. "The survival of two packs," Seraphine said simply. "The lives of hundreds of warriors who would die if the Ashwood pack ever tested our borders without the Drogmore alliance standing behind us. You may love Cassian Veyrath, Alara Windholt, but I intend to save him from himself, whether he thanks me for it or not." Alara did not know, then, how much truth and how much manipulation was tangled together in Seraphine's words. She would not understand the full shape of what Seraphine truly wanted until much later, when it was already far too late to matter to the two small heartbeats she had carried into that frozen border night. The accusation came on a night Alara would remember in exact, terrible detail, because it was the night everything she had built with Cassian over 6 years finally began to collapse beyond any repair. She was in the healer's den, preparing a tonic for one of the pack's elder wolves, when 3 warriors arrived at the door, their faces grim, and told her the council required her presence immediately. "For what reason?" Old Wren demanded, stepping between Alara and the warriors with more courage than her aging body probably should have allowed. "Theft," one of the warriors said. "Elder Morden's private ledgers have gone missing. A witness places the healer's apprentice near his chambers 2 nights past." "That's impossible," Alara said, her heart hammering. "I have never been near Elder Morden's chambers in my life." But when she arrived at the council hall, the ledgers were there, waiting, spread across the table for the assembled elders to see, pages detailing years of the council's private dealings, trade agreements, secret payments, the kind of information that could bring down half the pack's power structure if it ever reached the wrong ears. And beside them, damningly, sat a small silver hairpin Alara recognized instantly as her own, one she had lost weeks earlier and never found. "Explain this," Elder Morden said, his voice cold with a fury that felt entirely too rehearsed for a man supposedly discovering a betrayal in real time. "I don't know how that got there," Alara said, her voice shaking. "I have never touched those ledgers. I have never even been inside these chambers before tonight." "And yet your hairpin sits beside stolen council property," Morden said, "and 3 witnesses place you near my chambers on the night in question." Alara looked around the room, searching for Cassian's face, needing him to believe her the way she had needed him to believe her about so many things over the past few months. He stood near the back of the hall, his jaw tight, his eyes moving between her and the elders with an expression of pure, helpless conflict. "Cassian," she said, tell them I would never." "I know you wouldn't," he said quietly, stepping forward. "Elder Morden, this is clearly a mistake. Alara has no reason to steal your ledgers and no way to have accessed your private chambers without half the guard noticing. With respect, Alpha, Morden said, your judgment regarding this particular wolf has not exactly proven reliable of late. The room went very quiet at that, and Alara understood in that silence that everyone in the hall already knew about her and Cassian, about the twins, about the tangled mess of love and politics that had been quietly consuming the pack's leadership for months. The theft accusation was not truly about missing ledgers. It was a test, a public one, designed to see whether Cassian would choose her over the council's judgment when it mattered most. He hesitated. It was only a moment, a breath, the smallest fraction of time, but Alara felt it land in her chest like a physical blow, because in that hesitation she understood something she had been refusing to understand for weeks. That when it truly came down to a choice between her and the structure of power he had inherited, Cassian Veyrath did not know with certainty which way he would choose. I need to investigate this properly, he said finally, and though his words were careful, diplomatic, meant to sound like fairness rather than betrayal, Alara heard the truth underneath them clearly enough. He was not defending her. He was buying time to decide. Alara was confined to the healer's den under guard that night, the first time in 6 years that she had ever been treated as anything other than a welcome presence in Veyrath Hall. And she lay awake through the long hours of darkness with her hands folded over her belly, whispering promises to 2 small heartbeats that she did not yet know how she would keep. I did not steal those ledgers, she told old Wren, when Wren was permitted to bring her tea near dawn. I know, child, Wren said. I have known you since you were 16 years old and half frozen in a poacher's trap. You have never had a dishonest bone in your body. Someone placed that hairpin there. Someone wanted this accusation to land exactly where it landed. Who would do such a thing? Wren's expression grew heavy with something that looked almost like grief. I do not know for certain, she said, but I know that Bram Castle has visited Elder Morden's private chambers more often this past moon than in the previous 6 years combined. And I know that a wolf clever enough to serve as beta for a decade would have no trouble at all placing a hairpin where he wanted it found. Alara did not want to believe it. Bram had been part of the pack's daily life for as long as she had known Cassian, present at every important moment, familiar in a way that felt like family even when she could not have called them close, but sitting there in the gray hours before dawn. She found she could no longer dismiss the possibility. And once she allowed herself to consider it, she could not stop seeing all the small moments that suddenly made a different, darker kind of sense. The way he had watched her those past weeks, the gentle cruelty in his voice whenever he delivered bad news, the strange, patient calm with which he had told her, months ago, that she was always going to be something else. The council deliberated for 3 days over the theft accusation, 3 days during which Alara was permitted no visitors except old Wren, and Cassian sent no word at all. She told herself he was working behind the scenes to clear her name, that his silence was strategy rather than abandonment. She would learn, eventually, that silence, no matter how carefully explained afterward, feels exactly the same as abandonment to the person waiting on the other side of it. On the 3rd night, Bram came to her door alone, dismissing the guard with a wave of his hand. I wanted to see how you were holding up, he said, and there was that same gentle, terrible kindness in his voice that Alara would come to associate, forever after, with the worst moments of her life. Was it you, she asked before she could stop herself. The ledgers, the hairpin, was it you, Bram? Something flickered across his face there and gone so quickly she nearly convinced herself she had imagined it. Why would you think such a thing, Alara? He asked. I have known you for 6 years. I have always cared for your well-being. Then tell me the truth, she said. Please. If you have ever cared for me at all, tell me the truth. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its gentleness entirely, replaced by something flat and resolved that frightened her far more than open anger would have. The truth, he said, is that some things are bigger than what you or I want, Alara. The Council needs the Drogmore alliance secured. Cashin needs a pact that survives the coming years. And you need to understand that no accusation, true or false, will ever matter as much as the simple fact that you were never meant to be Luna of this pack. He left before she could respond, and Alara sat alone in the healer's den, shaking, finally certain of a truth she had been trying to avoid for weeks. Whatever love she and Cashin shared, it existed inside a structure built by men who had already decided, long before she ever understood the danger, that she would not be allowed to remain in it. The Council cleared Alara of the theft, in the end, 3 days later, though not because anyone had discovered the truth of what really happened. Old Ren, refusing to accept the accusation quietly, had gone directly to Elder Vashti, the only member of the Council who had ever shown Alara anything resembling fairness, and demanded a proper investigation of the guards who had been posted near Mordin's chambers the night in question. 2 of the 3 witnesses have withdrawn their statements, Vashti announced to the full council, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. Both claim they were encouraged to place Alara Windholt near the chambers, though neither will name who did the encouraging. Elder Mordin's face had remained perfectly composed throughout the announcement, which told Alara, more than any confession could have, exactly how deep the deception ran. Then the accusation is dismissed, Cashin said quickly, relief plain in his voice. Alara is free to return to her duties. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt a cold, creeping dread because she understood, watching Mordin's calm, unbothered face, that clearing an accusation was not the same thing as ending a threat. Whoever wanted her gone had simply failed with one method. She had no reason to believe they would not simply try another. "This isn't over," Alara told Cashin that night, as he held her in the healer's den, his relief at her innocence being confirmed still radiating off him like warmth from a fire. "It is over," he said. "You've been cleared. The Council knows the truth now." "The Council knows the accusation was false," she said. "That is not the same as the Council wanting me here. Cashin, someone placed my hairpin beside those ledgers. Someone wanted me removed badly enough to frame me for theft. Do you understand what that means?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, a dawning understanding he had perhaps been avoiding for longer than either of them wanted to admit. "You think it was someone close to us," he said finally. "I think," she said carefully, "that you should consider who benefits most from me disappearing from this pack before your binding to Seraphine, and who has access to both my belongings and Elder Mordin's private chambers." She watched him work through the possibilities, watched his face cycle through disbelief, denial, and finally something that looked uncomfortably close to recognition, though he refused to say the name out loud that night. The way one refuses to name a fear one is not yet ready to confront. "I'll look into it," he said instead. Quietly, "I promise you, Alara, I will find out who did this." She wanted to believe that promise the way she had believed all his other promises. She no longer had the luxury of that kind of faith, though she did not yet understand exactly how quickly the ground beneath them was about to give way entirely. The binding ceremony was moved forward by 2 moons, the Council citing renewed pressure from the Ashwood Pack's border incursions as justification for the change. Alara understood the real reason well enough. Someone on the Council, likely Mordin himself, wanted the ceremony completed before her pregnancy became visible enough for the whole pack to start asking questions the elders did not want asked. "You cannot let them rush this," she told Cashin, her hands pressed protectively over the small curve that had begun to show beneath her healer's robes. "Cashin, please, talk to them. Delay it." "I've tried," he said, and for the first time, she heard genuine desperation in his voice rather than careful diplomacy. "Alara, I don't know how to stop this without breaking the alliance entirely, and if I break it now, with the Ashwood Pack already testing our defenses, I risk the lives of every warrior in this pack. And if you don't stop it," she said quietly, "you risk the life you and I were supposed to build together." He had no answer for that, and his silence, once again, told her everything she needed to know about which risk he had already decided he could more easily live with. There was one conversation, in those final days before the binding, that Cashin never told Alara about until years later, when Torvin brought their children home, and there was finally room in both their lives for painful honesty. He had gone to Elder Mordin privately, without the rest of the council present, and asked him plainly whether there was any path forward that did not require abandoning either the alliance or the woman he loved. "There is always a path, Alpha," Mordin had told him, "for a wolf willing to pay its price. You could refuse the binding outright, declare Alara your Luna publicly, accept that the Drogmore alliance collapses, that the Ashwood Pact tests our borders without allied support, that warriors under your command may die defending territory you could have secured through marriage instead of love. That is a path. Are you prepared to walk it, knowing what it costs the pack you swore to protect?" Cashin had not answered him that day, and it was that silence, more than any single command from the council, that had truly sealed Alara's fate, because a council does not need to force an alpha's hand when his own hesitation does the work for them. Mordin understood this better than anyone. He had spent decades learning exactly how to let fear do what open cruelty could not, framing every choice as an impossible trade between love and duty, until the wolf standing before him became too paralyzed by the weight of that framing to act at all. "I keep asking myself," Cashin admitted to Torvin all those years later, "whether Mordin was right in some terrible way. Whether the alliance truly would have collapsed, whether warriors truly would have died, had I simply chosen Alara openly from the start. I will never know for certain. But I have come to believe that even if every fear he raised had come true, I still should have chosen her, and found some other way to protect this pack afterward, rather than protecting the pack by sacrificing the one wolf who never once asked me to choose between her and anyone else." "That is easy wisdom to reach," Torvin said, not unkindly, "once the cost has already been paid in full." "Yes," Cashin agreed quietly, "it is. I do not offer it as an excuse for what I failed to do, only as the truth I finally understand, too late to matter to the wolf, who deserved to hear it from me while she still could." Alara made a decision that night, alone in the healer's den, that she had been circling for weeks without quite letting herself land on it. If Cashin could not find the courage to choose her openly, she would have to find the courage to protect their children on her own. She began, quietly, to plan a way to leave the pack lands entirely, to travel south to a healer's guild she had corresponded with for years, where her skills would be welcomed, and her children would never have to grow up watched by a council that saw them as a threat to be managed rather than pups to be loved. She did not get the chance to put that plan into action before Bram found out what she intended. No one would ever know exactly how Bram learned of Alara's plan to leave. Perhaps he had been watching her closely enough that her careful preparations, the herbs she set aside, the letters she sent south, the small bag she packed and hid beneath a loose floorboard, had not gone as unnoticed as she believed. Perhaps someone she trusted had let something slip without realizing its significance. It did not matter in the end which explanation was true. What mattered was that, on the night before the binding ceremony, 3 days before Alara would have quietly slipped away from Veyrath lands forever, Bram came to the healer's den with 4 warriors behind him, and she understood, the moment she saw his face, that something had shifted beyond any hope of gentle resolution. "Alara Windholt," he said, and his voice carried none of its usual gentleness now, only a flat, official coldness that frightened her more than shouting ever could have. "By order of the council, you are to be escorted from Veyrath lands immediately." "On what grounds?" she demanded, backing away as the warriors advanced. "I have done nothing. I am carrying the Alpha's children." "That," Bram said, "is precisely the problem." "Where is Cashin?" she asked, her voice rising with panic she could no longer control. "Bram, where is Cashin? Let me speak to him." "The Alpha is occupied with preparations for tomorrow's ceremony," Bram said. He does not know about this, and by the time he does, it will already be finished. Ilara understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt like ice water down her spine, exactly what he intended. This was not an escort. This was a removal, planned carefully enough to happen while Cashin slept, unaware, believing tomorrow would simply be his binding day and nothing more. "Please," she said, her hands instinctively curling around her belly. "Please, Bram, whatever quarrel you have with me, my children have done nothing." "Your children," Bram said, and something in his voice cracked, just slightly, the first genuine emotion she had heard from him in weeks, "are exactly what the elders fear most. I'm not doing this because I hate you, Ilara. I am doing this because I understand better than you or Cashin ever have what happens to a pack when an old bloodline wakes up and starts making claims that shatter every alliance holding the North together. I am sorry. I truly am. But I will not let two pups undo everything this council has built to keep this territory safe." She fought them, as much as a pregnant Omega could fight 4 trained warriors, but it was never a fight she could have won. They bound her wrists with cold iron, the only metal capable of holding a struggling wolf regardless of shifted form, and half carried, half dragged her from Varath Hall into the freezing night, toward the border where she would spend her final hours, alone, waiting for the cold to finish what fear and betrayal had already started. By the time Ilara had finished remembering how she came to be here, chained at the border, she watched her own breath turn to frost in the air in front of her and found, having relived it all, that she was no longer quite as afraid as she had been when the memories began. Fear, she had learned, needs a future to feed on. Hers had grown very small and very certain, and there was a strange peace in that certainty, even now, even here. The pups had gone quiet, and she pressed her bound hands harder against her belly, willing them to move, to kick, to prove to her that they were still fighting the cold as fiercely as she was. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, little ones, not yet, please, not yet." As if in answer, a sharp, sudden pain rolled through her, and she understood, with the strange clarity that sometimes comes in the worst moments of a life, that her body had decided it was time, whether she was ready or not, whether there was any warmth or safety waiting to receive these children into the world. "No," she gasped, sinking to her knees against the chains. "No, not here, please, not here." But bodies do not negotiate, and pups do not wait for convenient circumstances. And so Ilara labored alone at the edge of Varath territory, chained to a post, snow gathering in her hair, bringing 2 lives into a world that had already shown them, before they had even drawn breath, exactly how little it valued them. No one would ever know how long it took. Time becomes strange in pain and cold, stretching and compressing in ways that make no sense afterward. She only knew that at some point, through the haze of exhaustion and frost, she heard the first small cry, and then, moments later, the second, and she understood that whatever else this night took from her, it had not taken them. "A boy," she whispered, cradling the first tiny body against her chest with hands still bound at the wrist, working the chain just enough to bring her arms close enough to hold him. "And a girl." She looked down at them in the pale moonlight, and she saw it immediately, the thing old Wren had told her about months ago, the thing she had laughed off as a bedtime story. A faint ring of silver catching the light in each of their small, newly opened eyes, like moonlight reflecting on still water. The mark of the old Varath crown, awake for the first time in generations, in 2 pups born in chains at the edge of the very lands their bloodline once ruled. "You're going to be safe," she whispered to them, though she did not know in that moment how such a promise could possibly be kept. "I don't know how, but I promise you, you are going to be safe." She pulled what little warmth remained in her body around them, wrapping them in her own healer's robes, pressing them against her skin the way every mother wolf instinctively knows to do, sacrificing her own warmth without a single moment of hesitation. Her hands were growing numb. Her thoughts were growing slow and strange, drifting in ways that frightened her less than they probably should. She thought of Cashin, sleeping in his warm bed, unaware that his children had just been born in the snow at the edge of his own territory. She thought of old Wren, who would search for her at dawn and find only chains and silence. She thought of the oak tree where he had marked her 6 years ago, and she found to her surprise that she did not feel hatred when she thought of him, only a deep, exhausted sorrow for the love that could have been, if only courage had come as easily to him as tenderness did. "Take care of your father," she whispered to her children, though she did not know if they could understand her yet or if they ever would. "He is not a bad wolf. He is only a frightened one. Perhaps someday when you are strong enough, you can teach him what real courage looks like." Footsteps sounded in the snow sometime later, though Alara could not have said how much time had passed. Her vision had grown dim at the edges, and the cold no longer felt like cold at all, only a strange, heavy warmth that she knew, somewhere in the healer's part of her mind that was still working, to be the final and most dangerous stage of freezing. "Ilara." The voice was unfamiliar, low and careful, belonging to someone she did not recognize through the haze clouding her thoughts. A figure knelt beside her in the snow, and she felt gentle hands working at the chains around her wrists, though she could not make sense of why a stranger would be here, at this border, at this hour. "My children," she managed to say, her voice barely more than a breath. "Please, take my children somewhere warm, please." "I will," the stranger said, and there was something steady and certain in his voice that made her believe him in a way she had not been able to believe anyone in a very long time. "I promise you, I will keep them safe. What are their names?" She tried to answer, but the words would not come, her thoughts scattering like snow caught in wind. She felt her body finally give up the fight it had been waging all night. Sinking into the strange, heavy warmth that she understood, distantly, was the last thing she would ever feel. The last thing she heard, before the darkness took her entirely, was her daughter's small cry rising into the freezing air, fierce and unafraid, as though she already understood that she had been born to survive whatever the world put in front of her. Cassian woke at dawn to an empty bed and a growing unease he could not name. He told himself, at first, that Alara had simply risen early for her healer's duties, but something about the silence of the hall felt wrong in a way that settled into his chest like a stone. He found old Wren in the healer's den, her face gray with a fear that mirrored his own. "She's gone," Wren said, before he could even ask. "I went to bring her morning tea, Alpha, and her bed was empty. Her healer's satchel is still here. She would never leave without it, not willingly." "Bram," Cassian said, the name arriving in his mouth before he had even fully understood why, some instinct connecting threads he had refused to connect for weeks. "Where is Bram?" They found the 4 warriors first, exhausted, returning through the border gate as the sun climbed higher, their faces carrying the particular blankness of wolves who have done something they do not wish to speak of. "Where is she?" Cassian demanded, gripping the nearest warrior by the collar with a strength that made the younger wolf's knees buckle. "Where is Alara?" "The border," the warrior said, his voice shaking. "Alpha Beta Castle ordered her removed to the border last night. By council order," he said. "We only followed the command." Cassian did not remember the run to the border afterward, only the cold burning in his lungs and the growing, suffocating certainty in his chest that he had made a mistake he would never be able to undo. He arrived to find broken iron chains lying empty in trampled, bloodied snow, and no sign at all of Alara, or of the children he had learned of only months before, and had never found the courage to properly claim. Cassian Verath did not attend his own binding ceremony that day. He stood instead at the border where the chains still lay broken in the snow, refusing to move, refusing to eat, refusing to speak to anyone who approached him, until old Wren finally knelt beside him in the frost and took his hands in hers the way she had once taken Alara's. "She is gone, isn't she?" Cassian said, and it was not a question. "The trackers found blood in the snow," Wren said gently, "but no body. Whoever came after the warriors left, Alpha, they took her somewhere. Whether that means she still lives, I cannot say, but I will not let you sit here and decide she is lost until we know for certain." Cassian did not answer. He was remembering in that moment, Every excuse he had made over the past months, every delay, every promise to speak to the council tomorrow instead of today, every small, cowardly hesitation that had, link by link, forged the very chains that had been wrapped around Alara's wrists. He understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to matter, that he had never once, not a single time, chosen her without also trying to keep everything else he had, the alliance, the council's favor, the comfortable structure of a life that asked nothing difficult of him. He had wanted her love without ever paying love's true price, which is the willingness to lose everything else for it. "Bram," he said finally, his voice flat and cold in a way none of his warriors had ever heard from him before. "Bring me Bram Castle." Bram did not run when the guards came for him, which surprised no one who truly knew him. He had never been a wolf who fled his own decisions, only one who had convinced himself for years that his decisions were justified by a duty larger than himself. "You knew," Cashin said, standing over him in the war room where, months earlier, Bram had first learned of the council's fears about Alara's bloodline. "You knew what they intended, and you did it yourself rather than let someone else carry the weight of it." "Someone had to," Bram said, and there was no defiance in his voice, only a tired, hollow certainty. "You would not act, Cashin. Not against the council, not for her, not even when she carried your own children. I did what I believed the pack needed. I do not expect you to forgive me for it." "I don't intend to," Cashin said, "but I want to understand something first. Did you know she was carrying twins with the old Mark? Did you know Bram and choose to leave her at that border anyway?" Bram was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, something in his composure finally cracked. "I knew what the elders feared," he said. "I told myself it was superstition. I told myself I was protecting the pack from an old story, not condemning two innocent pups to freeze in the snow. I have told myself many things this past night, Cashin, and none of them have let me sleep." Cashin ordered Bram stripped of his rank and confined, though he found, even in his fury, that he could not bring himself to demand a harsher punishment. Perhaps because some small, honest part of him understood that Bram had only been willing to do the cruel thing that Cashin himself had lacked the courage either to prevent or to properly forbid. The true weight of what had happened, Cashin knew, standing there in the cold morning light, belonged first to himself, and no punishment handed to Bram Castle would ever change that fact. Seraphine came to him 3 days later, finding him still standing at the border most mornings, staring at the empty place where the chains had hung, as though sheer will alone might conjure Alara back out of the frost. "I did not know," she said quietly, standing beside him without her usual careful poise. "Cashin, I swear to you, I did not know the elders intended to remove her by force. I believed the accusation against her at the council hall. I did not know it was manufactured." He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for the deception he had expected to find, and found instead something that looked almost like genuine grief. "Did you love me?" he asked, though the question surprised even himself as he asked it. "Or only the alliance?" "I do not know any more," Seraphine admitted. "I was raised, from the time I could walk, to believe that this binding was my purpose. I never let myself consider whether I wanted something different, because no one ever offered me the choice. Perhaps that makes me more like Alara than either of us realized. Neither of us was ever truly given the choice to decide our own worth in this pack." It was, Cashin would think later, the most honest conversation he ever had with Seraphine, and it marked the quiet, mutual understanding between them that whatever the council intended, they would not proceed with a binding built on grief and guilt rather than genuine choice. Seraphine returned to the Drogmore packlands within the month, and though the alliance strained under the change, it did not break, in part because Cashin finally found, in the aftermath of losing Alara, the courage he should have found months earlier, the courage to stand before the council and tell them plainly that he would rule by his own judgment from that day forward, not by the fear of men who had spent generations protecting their own power at the expense of anyone who threatened it. He searched for Alara and the children for years. He sent riders to every healer's guild in the north, questioned every trader who passed through Veyrath lands, followed every rumor of an Omega healer traveling with twin pups, no matter how thin or unlikely. He found nothing, and slowly the searching became less about hope and more about penance, a ritual he performed because stopping felt like accepting a truth he could not bear to accept. Old Wren aged visibly in those years, carrying her own grief for the girl she had raised like a daughter, though she never once told Cashin the small, private hope she carried quietly in her own heart, a hope built on a single detail the trackers had found in the snow that morning and never fully explained. The blood in the snow near the broken chains had not been enough, by any healer's understanding of such wounds, to account for a wolf freezing entirely to death. Someone, Wren believed, had come. Someone had taken Alara and the children somewhere. Whether Alara herself had survived that taking, Wren did not know, and did not dare hope for too loudly, in case hopping made the eventual grief harder to bear. She kept that small, quiet hope alive for 6 years, tending it the way she tended her herb gardens, patiently, without expecting quick results, until the day a stranger arrived at Veyrath Hall's gates asking to see the Alpha personally, claiming to carry news that could not wait. The stranger who arrived at Veyrath Hall's gates 6 years after that terrible night gave his name as Torvin Ashgrove, and he carried himself with the quiet, watchful bearing of a wolf who had spent his life protecting something far more important than himself. "Alpha Cashin," he said, kneeling briefly before rising to meet Cashin's eyes directly, a formality that told Cashin this wolf did not consider himself beneath him, only respectful of custom. "I have carried a truth for 6 years that I believe belongs to you, though I confess I have hesitated to bring it, uncertain of what kind of wolf I would find waiting to receive it." "Speak plainly," Cashin said, his heart already beginning to pound in a way he did not fully understand yet. "What truth?" "6 years ago," Torvin said, "I was tracking poachers along the northern border of your territory, a task my order has performed quietly for generations, protecting certain bloodlines the old packs would prefer to see erased. I came upon a woman, chained, freshly delivered of twins, already past saving by the time I reached her. I could not save the mother, Alpha Cashin. I have carried that failure with me every day since. But I saved her children, and I have raised them within my order's protection, waiting until I judged it safe to bring them home." Cashin's knees nearly gave beneath him, and he gripped the war room table to steady himself, his voice, when it finally came, barely more than a whisper. "Alara," he said. "Her name was Alara." "I know," Torvin said gently. "She said your name at the end and asked only that her children be kept safe. I have honored that request every day for 6 years, and I believe now that keeping them safe means finally letting them know their father, and letting their father finally understand what he lost and what still remains." "The children," Cashin said, his voice shaking, "are they?" "Alive," Torvin said. "Strong, gifted in ways that will not surprise you once I explain what my order discovered about them the very night I pulled them from the snow." Torvin explained, over the following hours, what his order, an ancient network of wolves called the Hallowmark, sworn since the fall of the old northern crown to protect any bloodline carrying the true royal mark from those who would see it permanently erased, had confirmed the very night he rescued the twins. Both children bore the silver ring in their eyes that old Wren had once described to Alara as a bedtime story, the mark of unbroken descent from the ancient Veyrath crown, awakened by a bond formed not through arrangement or alliance, but through genuine, freely chosen love. "The Hallowmark has watched your family's bloodline for 3 generations, Torvin said, waiting to see whether it would ever produce a trueborn heir again. We believed, honestly, that it never would, that the dilution from generations of political marriages had erased the possibility entirely. Your children proved us wrong, Alpha Cashin. They are the first true heirs the North has seen since the crown fell." "What does that mean?" Cashin asked slowly. "For them, for this pack?" "It means," Torvin said, "that any pack loyal to the old ways, Any wolf who remembers what the North lost when jealous lords scattered your family generations ago will recognize your children's claim the moment they see the mark in their eyes. It means power, alpha Cashin, real power, far beyond a single border pack's authority. It also means danger from every wolf who has built their own position on the assumption that such a claim would never resurface. Cashin sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the enormity of what he was being told, and beneath the shock, a slow, burning shame took root as he understood fully, for the first time, exactly what the elders had feared, and exactly what they had been willing to do to prevent it. Elder Mordin had not simply protected an alliance. He had protected an entire structure of stolen, illegitimate power, built upon the erasure of a bloodline that should have ruled the North honestly, generations ago. "I want to see them," Cashin said. "Please, Torvin, whatever else this means, whatever danger it brings, I want to see my children." Torvin studied him for a long moment, weighing something in his expression that Cashin could not fully read. "They have grown up hearing their mother's story," he said finally. "They know how she died, and they know, in broad terms, the failures that led to that night. I will not pretend to you, Alpha Cashin, that they will greet you with open arms simply because you share their blood. Kale, especially, carries anger he has not yet learned to set down. But Leora has always believed, since she was old enough to understand the story, that her father deserved a chance to prove he had changed. I brought them with me. They are waiting outside if you are ready." Cashin's hands trembled as he rose from his seat, 6 years of grief and guilt and desperate hope colliding at once in his chest. "I am ready," he said, though his voice shook with the admission that he did not, in truth, know whether he deserved to be. The children who walked through the war room doors a few minutes later were unmistakably Cashin and Alara's both. Kale tall for his age with Cashin's own storm-gray eyes and Alara's stubborn set of the jaw, Leora smaller and quicker, with Alara's warm brown hair, and an expression that studied Cashin with a careful, searching intelligence far beyond her 6 years. Both children's eyes carried the faint, unmistakable ring of silver that Torvin had described, catching the light of the war room's fire like moonlight on still water. "You're the Alpha," Kale said, not quite a question, standing very straight in a way that reminded Cashin painfully of himself at that age, learning to hide fear behind formality. "I am your father," Cashin said, kneeling so that he was level with them both, his voice breaking on the words. "I have searched for you both for 6 years. I did not know until this very hour that you had survived. I am so sorry. I am so sorry for what happened to your mother, and I know that sorry cannot possibly be enough." Leora studied him for a long moment, her small face serious in a way that made his chest ache. "Mama told Torvin your name before she went to sleep in the snow," she said quietly. "He said she wasn't angry when she said it, just sad. Does that mean you were sad too when you found out she was gone?" "Every single day since," Cashin said, tears finally spilling freely down his face, unashamed in front of his children in a way he had rarely allowed himself to be unashamed in front of anyone. "I loved your mother more than I ever found the courage to show her while she was alive. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure that failure never happens again, to either of you, or to anyone in this pack who deserves better than fear-driven silence." Kale's expression did not soften entirely, and Cashin understood, watching the careful distance the boy maintained, that trust would take far longer to rebuild than a single tearful confession in a war room. But Leora stepped forward, small and certain, and took her father's hand. "Okay," she said simply, "you can try. Mama would want you to try." It was not forgiveness. It was, Cashin understood, something more valuable than forgiveness. A chance, freely given by a child who had every right to withhold it, to become the father he had failed to become while there had still been time to matter to the mother of his children. Later that night, once the children had been settled into rooms Cashin had ordered prepared the very hour he learned they were alive, Torvin found him alone on the northern ridge, standing in nearly the same spot where, 6 years earlier, Alara had once teased him about telling the council their secret. "You will need to move carefully in the coming weeks," Torvin said, joining him at the edge of the ridge. There are wolves within your own council who will see your children's claim as a threat worth silencing again, given the chance. My order can offer protection, but only for so long. Eventually, Alpha Cashin, you will need to choose, publicly and without hesitation, whether you stand behind them completely. I have already chosen, Cashin said, and there was a settled certainty in his voice that had not existed there 6 years earlier. I spent years learning what it costs to hesitate. I do not intend to make that mistake twice. Good, Torvin said, because Kale and Leora will need more than a father who loves them quietly. They will need a father willing to be seen loving them, in front of every wolf who might wish otherwise. Cashin looked out over the moonlit territory below, the same view he had once shared with Alara under a sky full of stars, and felt, for the first time in 6 long years, something that resembled genuine hope rather than mere endurance. Then that is exactly what I intend to be, he said quietly, for as long as I have left to give them. Word of the children's return spread through Veyrath lands within days, and with it, word of the mark carried in their eyes, and the ancient claim that mark represented. Elder Mordin, upon hearing the news, did not wait for a formal summons before arriving at Veyrath Hall himself, his face carefully composed into an expression of concern that Cashin no longer had any patience for. Alpha Cashin, Mordin began, we must discuss the implications of this discovery carefully before word spreads further and destabilizes. There is nothing left to discuss privately, Elder Mordin, Cashin said, cutting him off in front of the full assembled council, his voice carrying the calm, settled authority of a wolf who had finally stopped negotiating around his own convictions. 6 years ago, you and this council decided that a mother and her unborn children were an acceptable price to pay for your own comfortable arrangement of power. I allowed it. Through cowardice I will carry for the rest of my life. I will not allow it again. Alpha, be reasonable, Mordin said, a note of genuine alarm entering his voice for the first time. The stability of the North depends on. The stability of the North, Cashin said, has depended for generations on this council's willingness to bury the truth of a stolen crown rather than answer for it honestly. My children exist, Elder Mordin. Their claim exists, whether this council finds it convenient or not. I intend to acknowledge them publicly, formally, as my true-born heirs, and I intend to finally tell this pack the truth about the bloodline this council has spent generations pretending did not survive. The hall fell into a stunned, uneasy silence, and Cashin understood, watching the various expressions ripple across the assembled elders' faces, that he had just done something none of them had believed him capable of doing when Alara had needed him to do it most. He had chosen truth and courage over comfort and fear, even knowing the cost it might carry. The reckoning that followed was neither swift nor entirely simple, because restoring 6 years of buried truth rarely unfolds as cleanly as a single dramatic confession in a war room. Some elders, particularly the younger ones who had chafed for years under Mordin's cautious, fear-driven leadership, welcomed the change, seeing in Kale and Leora's return a chance to finally step out from beneath the shadow of an old rebellion none of them had chosen. Others, loyal to Mordin and the structure that had protected their own comfortable positions for decades, resisted fiercely, and for a time, Veyrath lands existed in a tense, uncertain balance between the old guard and the possibility of something new. Bram Castle, still confined since the night of Alara's death, requested an audience with Cashin once the news of the twins' survival reached him, and Cashin, though he still carried a fury toward the wolf that had not fully faded, agreed to hear him. I did not know they would live, Bram said quietly, when Cashin stood before his cell. I want you to know that, Cashin, though I understand it changes nothing about what I did. I believed I was protecting this pack from a danger that would tear it apart. I was wrong about the danger. I was not wrong that fear drove every choice I made that night, and fear is not an excuse a wolf should ever accept from himself. No, Cashin agreed, it isn't. I do not ask for forgiveness, Bram said. I only ask that whatever justice you decide upon, You remember that I am not the only wolf in this pack who chose fear over courage that night. I simply carried the chains myself, rather than merely permitting someone else to." Cashin considered his old friend's words for a long time before finally deciding Bram's punishment: permanent exile from Vareth lands, stripped of all rank and title, though spared the harsher penalties some on the council demanded. It was not, Cashin understood, true justice for what had been lost. No punishment could restore Elara to her children, or to the years Cashin himself had lost with them. But it was, he decided, an honest reckoning rather than a convenient one, and that honesty mattered more to him now than it ever had before. Kale's anger softened slowly over the following months, not through any single grand gesture, but through the patient, daily accumulation of a father who showed up, again and again, even when his son gave him little reason to expect warmth in return. Cashin learned to sit quietly with the boy in the evenings, asking nothing, offering only presents, until one night, nearly a year after their reunion, Kale finally spoke first. "Torvin says Mama used to talk about you like you were the bravest wolf she'd ever met," Kale said, staring into the fire rather than at his father. "Before everything happened, I mean, before the council." "I was brave about some things," Cashin said carefully. "Never brave enough about the things that mattered most. I am trying to be different now, Kale. I know that trying does not erase what I failed to do when your mother needed me, but I hope someday it might mean something." Kale was quiet for a long time, and then, slowly, he leaned against his father's side the way he had never once allowed himself to do in the year since their reunion. "It means something now," he said quietly. "Not everything, but something." Cashin held his son close, and for the first time since that terrible frozen night 6 years earlier, he allowed himself to believe that whatever else he had lost, he had not lost everything. There is one more thing worth telling before this story closes, because it matters more than the crown, more than the council's reckoning, more even than Bram's exile or Morden's quiet fall from power, once the truth of his schemes fully came to light. It is a small thing, the kind of detail easily lost beneath the weight of politics and prophecy, but old Wren always insisted it was the truest proof of who Elara had been, and who her children were becoming in her absence. Leora, it turned out, carried a gift the healers of Vareth had never before recorded in any pack's history. She could sense, with a startling and unerring clarity, exactly where pain lived in another creature's body. The way her mother once could, only more strongly, more instinctively, as though 6 years of grief and longing had sharpened rather than dulled whatever gift had passed between them. She began following old Wren into the healer's den before she had even reached her 7th year, small hands hovering over injured warriors with a confidence that startled everyone who watched her work. "You have her hands," Wren told her once, watching the girl carefully press cooling herbs against a hunter's wounded shoulder. "Your mother's hands, exactly. She used to hum while she worked, the same little tune you're humming right now. I never taught her that. She must have simply always carried it in her, the way you carry it now." "Torvin says gifts like this run in families," Leora said, not looking up from her work. "Do you think that means some part of Mama is still here? In my hands, I mean." "I think," Wren said, her voice thick, "that is exactly what it means, child." Kale's gift revealed itself differently, and more slowly, emerging not in the healer's den but on the training grounds, where the pack's warriors first noticed that the young heir seemed to sense danger before it arrived. A subtle prickling awareness that let him step aside from a blow half a breath before it landed, or call out a warning before an ambush fully revealed itself during border patrols. Torvin believed it was a fragment of the old crown's protective instinct, the same awareness that had once let the ancient Vareth kings sense threats to their pack before their advisors ever brought word of danger to them directly. Cashin believed, privately, that his son had simply learned, far too young, exactly what it cost a family when danger was allowed to arrive unchallenged, and had decided, somewhere deep in his growing bones, that he would never again let harm slip past him unnoticed the way it had slipped past his father 6 years earlier. Whatever the true source of their gifts, both children grew into their strength with a steadiness that made the whole pack slowly, quietly begin to trust the strange, unlikely story of their survival, and to trust, too, the changed alpha who now ruled beside them rather than above them, listening to counsel rather than simply accepting it, weighing courage against comfort in every decision and choosing, more often than not, the harder and more honest path. Old Wren wept the day Kale and Leora were formally presented before the full pack as Cassion's true-born heirs, the ancient silver mark in their eyes catching torchlight as the assembled wolves knelt, one by one, in recognition of a bloodline the North had believed extinguished for generations. She wept for the girl she had raised like a daughter, gone 6 years now, who would never see this moment. And she wept, too, for the strange, aching gratitude of watching that girl's children stand tall and safe in the very lands where she had once nearly died protecting them. She would be proud, Torvin said quietly, standing beside her as the ceremony continued, Cassion kneeling formally before his own children in a gesture that acknowledged, publicly, that he served their claim as much as they served his pack. She would, Wren agreed. Though I think more than proud, she would simply be relieved. She only ever wanted them safe, Torvin. Everything else, the crown, the bloodline, all of it, mattered far less to her than 2 small heartbeats she carried through a night she did not know she would survive. Leora, 6 years old and already carrying herself with a quiet, watchful dignity that reminded everyone who looked closely enough of her mother, turned partway through the ceremony to find old Wren's face in the crowd, and offered her a small, private smile that belonged only to the 2 of them, an acknowledgement of a story passed down carefully, in quiet moments from healer to child, keeping Alara's memory alive in the details that mattered most. The North remembers now, in the years that followed, a story told in the border villages on cold winter nights, of a healer's apprentice who loved an alpha with everything an orphan girl had to give, who was betrayed by fear and cowardice, and a council desperate to protect its own comfortable power, and who died in the snow at the edge of the very lands her children would one day inherit, protecting a bloodline she did not fully understand she carried until the very end. They tell it not as a story of tragedy alone, but as a story of what love, given honestly and without condition, can plant in the world even when it is never given the chance to fully bloom in the life of the one who planted it. Every winter, when the frost creeps across the northern border, the pack leaves a small bundle of frost bloom at the old post where the chains once hung, a quiet tribute to the mother who gave her warmth so that 2 small heartbeats could grow up to inherit a crown she never lived to see restored. Cassion visits that post every year alone on the anniversary of the night he lost her, and every year he says the same thing, quietly, into the cold northern wind. They are safe, he says. They are strong, and they are kind, and they carry your courage in everything they do. I am sorry it took losing you to teach me what courage truly costs. I will spend the rest of my life making sure it was not a lesson learned in vain. The wind never answers him, but sometimes the pack likes to think it carries his words north, toward wherever brave, gentle hearts go when the world finally lets them rest. The end.